Yes, hello once again, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and in this next feature clip we're going to take a look at another classic from the early 1980s. Now this particular bike was actually a machine that I featured on my YouTube channel many years ago when it was in its infancy, but today I'd like to do an updated version of this bike purely as a bit of a tribute to the owner and rider of the bike, which we sadly lost earlier on here in 2023. So we're going to dive straight into that video now and take a look at Calum Wilson's 1983 510TC Fourstroke Husqvarna.
Okay, so this featured machine here is another bike that I actually covered for a dirt bike magazine some years ago, and at that time I also did a short video of the bike to put on my YouTube channel, which at that time was in the early stages of its development. But what I'd like to do here is to do an updated version of this bike, and for it also to be a bit of a tribute to the bike's owner, Calum Wilson, who we sadly lost earlier in 2023. And so essentially what we have here is a 1983 510TC four-stroke Husqvarna, which as you've no doubt guessed isn't a fully stock original example, because this machine's undergone a full refurbishment and it doesn't have all of its stock 1983 parts still fitted, mainly due to what happened to the bike before it had to be rebuilt. So if you'll just bear with me for a couple of minutes, I'll try and put you in the picture. Now, the story of our Husky really begins with Calum attending a classic race event and then returning home after a very successful race day out, and then of course just parking his van, as we all do, in his driveway outside his house. Now, because Calum had arrived home late at night, he decided not to take both of his bikes out of the back of the van for their usual post-race wash, and he just left them locked in his transporter until the morning. And when I say both, I mean this 510TC Husky, and Calum also had a lovely Shenny Honda in the back of the van as well. Now, it was later that evening that Calum was awakened by neighbours who were shouting and banging on his door to try and alert him to the fact that his van was now well alight and flames rising high into the night air. And by the time the emergency services arrived and extinguished the flames, very little remained of the van and, more importantly, the two bikes that were inside. And as you can see from this picture, the van was totally gutted, and inside it was Calum's Husqvarna and his Curtis Honda as well. But it was the big Husqvarna who suffered most of the damage, and these pictures of the bike were taken soon after it was safe enough to have them removed from the burnt out transporter. And as you can see, all of the plastic parts, the cables, controls, the electrics, and most of the other bits and pieces that were non-metallic were just fried to a crisp. So as you can gather, this was going to take a ton of work to get the big Husky back to its old self again. But just in case you're interested, the cause of the fire was traced back to a faulty component in the van's central locking system, where some kind of electrical short circuit had taken place and it started the fire. And although both bikes were extensively damaged, Calum still wanted to get the Husqvarna repaired as soon as possible, because this was his number one race bike and he needed it back on the track ASAP so that he could continue competing at classic and twin shock events in his native Scotland. Now, when it came down to the actual restoration of the bike, Calum knew straight away that getting his beloved bike back to its old self again wasn't going to be an easy task. And although Calum was quite handy with the spanners, he knew that this job was way over his head. Plus, with his heavy workload commitment, he thought that he wouldn't have the time to put the hours in as well to get it all done. So the best thing to do was just to give the bike to somebody who knew their way around these bikes. And so Calum then delivered what was left of the bike to local man Joe McLean with instructions for him to do a full rebuild on the bike. Now, Joe McLean's part in this restoration was to completely strip the bike down to its last nut and bolt, and then farm out most of the bike's parts to be refurbished by various experts in their field, and then have them all returned to him when they were completed so that he could begin the reconstruction. But the big 510 Husqvarna motor would all be done by Joe himself, because he knows his way around these big four-banger Huskies, so that particular part of the job should be pretty straightforward for him. And so first up it was the bike's chassis, which was initially inspected for any signs of damage before that part, along with the fork bottoms, the swing arm and the rear shock springs, were all sent to the local painters for sandblasting and powder coating. And as you can see, when all of these parts came back from the paint shop, these were just about as good as new once again. Now, as you'd expect, the bike's big 510 engine handled the extreme heat very well, although the casings did suffer some tarnishing and damage to the engine's paint surfaces, and other non-metallic parts like ignition parts and carburetor intake rubbers, etc., were all basically just fried to a crisp during the inferno. Although when all of the casings and other internals were stripped down, they were then boxed up and then sent for soda blasting in order that they could be super clean, so that they could be inspected for any damage before commencing the engine rebuild. But basically, the bottom half of the engine was in quite good condition considering what it had just been through, but it was all still good, so all of the various seals and bearings and gaskets were renewed, and also because the engine was being rebuilt and the history and the mileage of the cam chain was unknown, this again was replaced just to be on the safe side. But once all of the other internal components were fitted back into the casings, like the gear clusters and the clutch, etc., the bottom part of the engine was more or less now complete, so Joe could then turn his attention to the top end of the Husky's 510 motor. And one of the other items that was quite high on the list of the engine's refurbishment was to try and do something about those quite troublesome two-part Husky valves in the cylinder head, which, as many Husky owners already know, are basically the Achilles heel of these big four-stroke engines. So these parts were then replaced with a set of upgraded single part valves instead, because, as you know, those old two-part valves were a bit prone to breaking up and could eventually lead to causing major engine damage. Now, the bike's engine prior to the fire was painted all black, and after all of the soda blasting took place to remove and clean the old paint, it was decided to just leave the cylinder and the cylinder head without any paint this time round, even although that wasn't the original look for 1983. Although in terms of their performance, these single-cylinder twin exhaust port Husky 4-banger engines, even in their standard trim, these were still pretty awesome power plants, and that's even before you bolted on things like hot cams and other high performance racing parts. But as you'd expect, these twin header pipes and most of the exhaust system and both tailpipes survived intact, and most of the damage on these parts was really just cosmetic, and they only really required some cleaning and then repainting. And both of these tailpipes also underwent the same treatment as the headers, with cleaning and repainting, and these were again dismantled, and then the old silencer packing was removed and then replaced. But when you're chasing one of these big 510s around the racetrack, there's certainly no mistaking what bike you're following when you see a pair of these big tailpipes sticking out of the rear. But once the refurbishment was all completed, these tailpipes were certainly as good as they were in 1983. Now, naturally, most of the bike's rubber and plastic parts took the brunt of the fire damage, and a new rubber carburetor intake was also sourced and then fitted. But as far as I know, the bike's original Mikuni carburetor was just cleaned and then reused on the bike's rebuild. But again, the bike's original plastic airbox was unfortunately unable to be used again, and so a new custom-made alloy replacement part was then sourced from Husky specialist HVA factory here in the UK, who also helped out with many of the other brand new parts required for this build. So during the fire, the bike's front forks did suffer some damage, which again was superficial, but the heat did damage their paintwork and the outer stanchion dust caps and seals. So these forks underwent a full refurbishment with brand new seals, oil, and also the lower parts of the forks underwent repainting when the rest of the frame and all of the other white parts of the chassis were at the painters. But after these were all put back together and bolted onto the bike again, they looked every bit as good as they would have done when they left Husky HQ back in 1983. And once again, both of the bike's front and rear brake hubs were completely dismantled, and all of the old spokes were removed, and the hubs were stripped of their damaged black paint and then repainted in this nice shiny new black coating. Now, this twin leading shoe setup here at the front was quite a powerful stopper for an old school drum brake from the 1980s, and this rear hub again was also treated to the self-same procedure as the front hub and its brake. Now, surprisingly though, the bike's original wheels did suffer some damage in the heat, and Calum opted not to use them on the bike's reconstruction, and he decided to go for just a pair of SM Pro Blue anodized rims instead, and so these were all relaced back onto the newly refurbished hubs. But these blue rims may not be to everybody's taste, but then again, Calum couldn't be sure of just how much damage the heat had done to the original wheels. And so as we move on to the bike's rear shocks, which once again suffered significant damage from the flames, and at first glance it looked like just a new set of shock mounts, and maybe a repaint would sort them out, but the shock's internal seals and other parts couldn't be guaranteed to be damage free, and so a full strip down and rebuild was really the only answer from a safety point of view. But when you see these shocks now completely finished and repainted with their refurbished springs and new graphics, it's quite hard to distinguish them from brand new items. And of course, we already know that these ITC Husky shocks are really just Öhlins units with a different paint scheme and different graphics, but they were certainly a perfect choice for these big four-banger Husqvarnas. But certainly one of the saving graces of the bike's parts were that this 83 machine had a metal fuel tank, which thankfully only really had a small amount of gas in it at the time, and of course if it had been a plastic item, then it would have almost certainly added to fuel the fire. But this fuel cell only really required blasting, stripping and repainting, and a new fuel cap and petrol tap was also sourced and fitted to the tank. And to complete the refurb of the tank, brand new graphics were then added to bring this fuel cell back to almost better than brand new condition. And also the bike's seat once again was completely destroyed in the fire, and nothing could really be rescued from either the seat's cover, foam padding, or even the seat base. So all that was left to do was contact Andy Elliott again at HVA Factory, who came up with exactly what was required, and even supplied this seat cover as well, which more or less put our Husky's seat back to its old self once again. But naturally, all of the plastic parts on our 510 were the very first to fall foul of the inferno, and they just ended up as little blobs of plastic on the floor of Calum's van. But it was nothing that couldn't be put right with another visit to HVA Factory, who had a full set of plastics for Calum's bike with two side panels, front and rear mudguards, and a front number plate as well, which more or less completed the cosmetic side of the bike's build. But again, that's what makes these old Huskies a very good choice as a vintage racer, because there are still sources like HVA who still have new old stock parts for these Husky classics. Now again, as you'd expect, all of the bike's controls, cables, grips and even the soft alloy levers did suffer some damage from the fire, so these again were all replaced with brand new parts, and a pair of modern style handlebars were also bolted into place, because Calum was again unsure if the heat of the fire had maybe damaged the original bars and maybe softened or maybe weakened them, so it was probably best to be on the safe side and fit a set of brand new ones just to be sure. Now, it's said that from the bike's original strip down to its eventual completion to this kind of finished state, it took Joe McLean just a few months to complete, with most of the time being taken up waiting on new parts to arrive from all the different various outside suppliers. But the downside to this particular restoration was that although Calum's van transporter was fully insured, and eventually it was written off. But both of the bikes that were in the back of it weren't covered under Calum's current policy, so he had to fork out the money for the big Husky's refurbishment from his own pocket, although what the eventual figure was for the final bill was never disclosed, but I'll wager that it wouldn't have been cheap. Although, as you can guess, when the completed bike was then handed back to Calum and unveiled, naturally, he was super pleased with the way that the bike had turned out. And it was actually now in a much better condition than it was before the actual damage. But of course, this is just part one of a two-part story, because Calum's other race bike, his big four-stroke Shenny Honda, also suffered similar damage to this big Husky. But Calum did tell me at the time I took these pictures that that was another project for another day. Now, I did manage to find a short video of Calum starting the bike after it was nearing completion. Now, it didn't have its finished graphics on the bike at this time, but at least you can get to have a quick listen to what the engine sounds like after it's finished rebuild. So as you can hear there, it's still quite a nice sweet sounding 510 engine after its recent rebuild. But Calum did go on to race this bike for many years after its completion, and he certainly enjoyed some success as well during that time. Although, as I said, I already have a similar video to this posted on my channel from years back, but this particular version was just to be my personal tribute to a friend that I knew very well from the race circuits around Scotland and the north of England for many years. But we lost Calum quite suddenly earlier in 2023, and he's without doubt a rider and a personality that is still missed around the racing paddocks, even to this day.